The streets of Nairobi were silent except for the sound of church bells and car horns, not in traffic but in mourning. Kenya had just lost one of its greatest sons, Raila Odinga, a man whose voice had carried the hopes of generations. Across the country, candles flickered, people wept, and the news channels played his old speeches, the voice of resistance, of democracy, of the right to question power. But while the nation grieved, something else quietly unfolded behind the heavy gates of State House. Without warning, President William R. signed 8 new bills into law all in one day. 8. Not symbolic declarations or ceremonial amendments, but laws that now touch the very heart of every Kenyan's life, the land beneath their feet, the money in their banks, the privacy of their phones, and the freedom of their voices online. The timing was strange. As the nation was still searching for words of comfort, the president's first public message was not one of condolence, it was a photo of his signature on those 8 bills. Some called it coincidence, others called it strategy, but many Kenyans called it a story about control. Because in the language of politics, timing is never innocent. When laws are signed while citizens are distracted by grief, one must ask what kind of nation is being quietly rewritten in the background, what kind of democracy legislates in silence. Tonight we go law by law. We look beyond the promises and see the patterns, the power, the control, and the cost of silence. And as you listen, ask yourself, is Kenya safer today or simply quieter? Please share if you feel you're among the few who still ask questions when others look away. Subscribe if you believe that truth is more important than headlines, because sometimes what's signed in silence changes a nation's destiny. It began with a signature 8 to be exact, drawn in blue ink on crisp white paper inside State House. Outside, the air in Nairobi was thick with grief. Inside, the machinery of government was moving faster than ever. That day, President William R. enacted 8 new laws, each one seemingly technical, bureaucratic, even dull on the surface, but together they would reshape the architecture of Kenya's power. They were passed not in chaos, but in quiet precision, and that silence made them even more unsettling. The first was the Computer Misuse and Cybercrime Amendment Bill. The government framed it as a shield against online fraud, terrorism, and data theft. On paper, who could oppose such protection? Kenya's digital economy has indeed exploded, and with it scams, identity theft, and cyber attacks. Yet hidden between those legal clauses was a new kind of weapon, a digital kill switch. It gave the state the authority to block entire websites, delete posts, or freeze accounts under broad terms like false information or threats to public order. No court orders, no transparency, just discretion. Article 19, an international rights group, warned that the law's language was dangerously vague. In Kenya, where dissent already carries a price, that vagueness can be deadly. Under the banner of national security, truth itself could become illegal. The second was the Privatization Bill of 2025. It looked like an economic reform, a path to attract investment and reduce debt. But in reality, it quietly removed Parliament's power to approve the sale of public assets. From now on, the National Treasury, answerable directly to the executive, could privatize state corporations, ports, pipelines, energy plants, even banks without public debate. This wasn't just a financial change, it was a constitutional one. It transferred control from the people's representatives to a board handpicked by the presidency. And history gives a grim warning. Kenya's past privatizations, the railways, Mumia's Sugar, Kenya Airways, left behind job losses, ghost towns, and unaccounted billions. Now the same playbook was being legalized. The third law touched the soul of Kenya land. The National Land Commission Bill of 2023 and the Land Management Amendment came wrapped in noble words: justice, fairness, reform. They promised to address historical injustices, but again, timing and details told another story. The law reintroduced limits on when victims could file land claims, effectively locking out thousands of displaced families who lacked access or awareness. It gave the Ministry of Lands new authority to revise rates and fees by regulation, meaning without parliamentary debate. It also widened the scope of compulsory acquisition. The state could now seize property in the name of public interest, a phrase with no clear definition. In a country where land equals life, that is not reform, it is re-centralization. Power once distributed among commissions and communities was quietly pulled back to the executive center. Next came the Wildlife Conservation and Management Amendment of 2023, a law that sounded almost poetic, protecting elephants, lions, and forests. It mandated that 5% of park revenue go to local communities and transferred management of Amboseli National Park to Kajiado's County, a progressive move on the surface. But critics noted that the same elite who owned vast conservancies, sometimes on land taken from indigenous groups, would still benefit most. 5% of someone else's land isn't justice. It's a tip for silence. Then there was the National Police Service Commission Amendment of 2024 promising to improve welfare counseling and fairness for officers. It required every county to establish police wellness centers and made disciplinary processes more transparent. For a force long plagued by low morale and political interference, that sounded hopeful. Yet beneath the optimism lingered a familiar risk. The Commission's members are presidential appointees. And in Kenya, control over promotions has always meant control over loyalty. And finally, the laws of the future, the Virtual Asset Service Providers Bill of 2025 and the Air Passenger Service Charge Amendment. The first one legalized and regulated cryptocurrency and blockchain ventures, making Kenya the first in East Africa to formalize the digital economy. The second quietly changed who controls revenue from air travel, giving the Transport Ministry power to decide how those funds are shared away from Parliament toward the executive. Each bill taken alone could be defended as progress. Together, they tell a more sobering story, a nation where laws that sound like reform are in fact redistributions of power, from public to private, from parliament to presidency, from citizens to systems, 8 signatures, 1 pattern, and one unspoken question lingering behind it all. Was this Kenya's day of mourning or the day democracy quietly changed shape? When the news broke, most people didn't even notice the laws at first. They were watching the funeral coverage, the flags at half-mast, the tributes to Raila Odinga, the man they called Baba, the conscience of a restless democracy. But a few sharp-eyed Kenyans scrolling through X caught something odd, a tweet from the president's account not offering condolences, but boasting of 8 bills signed into law. It was that moment, quiet, almost invisible, that changed everything. Because even before the mourning period ended, people began to connect the dots. The comments poured in. We shall revisit this. You know very well Kenyans are distracted by Baba's death. This feels planned. In a country where timing is never neutral, grief had become a political curtain. The climax of this story is not a single law, but the realization that power had moved quietly and permanently. 3 laws, cybercrime, privatization, and land, formed a triangle of control. Together, they redrew the lines of what it means to be free. Let's start online, where freedom now lives and dies with a button. Under the new cybercrimes law, a journalist exposing corruption could be accused of spreading false information. A blogger asking where public funds went could be labeled a threat to public order. The government now held what activists called the digital kill switch. Delete first, justify later. During last year's protests, hundreds were arrested under a similar law from 2018. Now, the same arrests could happen faster, cleaner, and legally. It was, as one lawyer put it, a velvet coup in cyberspace. Then came the economy. The Privatization Act allowed public assets, the ports, power grids, and refineries to be sold without Parliament's approval. No televised debate, no oversight, no paper trail until it's too late. A member of the civil society put it bluntly, this isn't deregulation. It's dispossession legalized. If the old Kenya railways and Mumia sugar stories taught anything, it's that privatization without scrutiny means wealth flows upward and outward to foreign investors, to political allies, to silence. And this time it was all wrapped in the respectable language of efficiency. Then came the earth itself, the land laws. For ordinary Kenyans, land is not just property, it is memory, ancestry, belonging. But under the new rules, deadlines and revaluations turned ownership into a privilege that could expire. Miss a deadline, you lose your claim. Can't afford the new rates, you lose your home. And if the state wants your land for public interest, the phrase is so vague that almost anything, a road, a resort, even a foreign-owned conservancy, can qualify. As one elder from Mau Forest said on radio, they took our forests before. Now they're taking the meaning of ownership itself. By the time journalists began to cover these laws, the damage was already done. The National Land Commission Bill and privatization law were signed, sealed, and gazetted, and while the nation was still watching Raila's casket being lowered into the ground, the government gazette published new directives expanding executive powers over digital content and state assets. That's when the anger started to spread, slowly at first, then louder, from universities, from civic groups, from faith leaders. But the irony was cruel. Those who protested online risked being silenced under the same new cyber law. Those who organized in the streets faced an expanded police system, also recently restructured by the National Police Service Commission Amendment, giving the government more influence over promotions and transfers, international watchdogs noticed. Article 19 Human Rights Watch and local NGOs warned that Kenya's reforms were eroding constitutional safeguards under the disguise of modernization. But official foreign responses were muted. The EF and World Bank, busy tracking Kenya's fiscal reforms, welcomed the privatization measures as necessary for efficiency. Efficiency, for whom that question never made it into the press briefings. Inside the country, journalists called it the week of silence. While television networks replayed old footage of Odinga's speeches about democracy, the government rewrote the rulebook of democracy itself. This was the emotional peak, not a protest, not a headline, but a quiet realization among ordinary citizens. Their digital spaces, their land, their public wealth all could now be managed, censored, or sold, and the people would only learn about it afterward. A middle-aged shopkeeper in Nakuru summed it up better than any analyst. They tell us, these laws protect us. But from who? From the thieves or from the truth? That is the question that still echoes. Because control does not arrive with tanks or soldiers anymore. It comes with signatures, ceremonies, and smiles. And sometimes it comes on the very same day a nation is too heartbroken to notice. In the weeks that followed, Kenya began to change, not with riots, not with rallies, but with a quiet, uneasy stillness. It was as if the country was holding its breath. On social media, the tone shifted overnight. Bloggers who used to post daily about government mismanagement started sharing only sunrise photos and sports scores. Whistleblowers went silent. Independent journalists began adding disclaimers to every story. All views expressed here are personal. A kind of digital self-censorship crept in not by decree, but by fear. Because everyone knew what the cybercrime law could do, no one wanted to be the test case. That's how freedom fades, not with mass arrests, but with hesitation. A journalist doesn't delete her story. She simply doesn't write it. A citizen doesn't stop thinking. He just stops posting. And within months, the digital heartbeat of Kenyan democracy, that vibrant, argumentative, fearless conversation, grew faint. Meanwhile, the economic consequences of the privatization law began to surface. A few state corporations were quietly listed for sale. The Kenya Ports Authority, the National Oil Corporation, and smaller regional utilities suddenly appeared in Treasury memos marked open to investment. But investment from who and on what terms? Without parliamentary oversight, these decisions were now executive privileges. Deals could be signed behind closed doors, and citizens would only learn of them once tariffs rose or jobs disappeared. Economists warned that privatization without scrutiny was like auctioning the family home to pay 1 month's rent. Short-term relief, long-term loss. For the first time, ordinary Kenyans began to ask whether efficiency was just a polite word for extraction. Then came the human toll of the land reforms. Families in the Rift Valley and the coastal regions found themselves caught in new bureaucratic webs, new fees, new forms, new deadlines. The law that promised justice for past injustices now turned into a legal labyrinth where only the wealthy could afford lawyers. Widows who had farmed the same soil for 50 years were told their cases had expired. Younger farmers spoke of surveyors showing up unannounced to revalue their land. In Kenya, where ancestral graves lie on family plots, land disputes are not just about ownership, they are about identity. And identity, once questioned, unravels everything else. This is how citizens lose faith not all at once, but piece by piece. First, the journalist grows quiet. Then the farmer loses his claim. Then a power company changes hands without explanation. And one morning, people wake up realizing they still have a country, but no control over it. Civil society groups tried to fight back. Petitions were filed in court challenging sections of the Cybercrime and Privatization Acts. But the legal process moved slowly, and by the time hearings began, the laws were already in force. It was like trying to chase a shadow that had already vanished into the ground. In the police force, the reform law meant to promote wellness and fairness turned into another instrument of hierarchy. Officers complained that promotions still favored loyalty over merit. The new wellness centers remained underfunded, existing mostly as press releases. Morale improved briefly, then sank deeper than before. "You can't counsel away corruption," one retired inspector said bitterly. Politically, the damage ran deeper. By consolidating authority across cyberspace, land finance, and public assets, the executive had built a framework of total discretion, what some analysts called a constitutional rerouting. Every road of accountability now led to one address: the presidency. And yet, there was no protest, no visible rebellion, only the slow realization that democracy had changed shape, that it could still wear the same uniform of elections and speeches, but inside it was hollowing out. In the end, what was lost was not just freedom, but trust, the invisible currency that holds a nation together. And once trust is gone, rebuilding it takes more than laws. It takes truth. And truth in this new Kenya had just been priced out of reach. From across the Atlantic, the story of Kenya's 8 laws might seem distant, another local episode in Africa's long struggle between reform and corruption. But to anyone who has lived through the Patriot Act or followed the debates around digital surveillance, it sounds eerily familiar. In Washington after 9/11, the word security became sacred. Every new power wiretaps, airport scans, data sweeps was justified in its name. 2 decades later, Americans learned that national security is the most convenient disguise for permanent control. And that's exactly what Kenya is now facing in its own language and laws. The Cybercrime Amendment echoes that same logic: protect the people by monitoring them. The Privatization Bill mirrors Western austerity playbooks once promoted by the IMF and World Bank: privatize, deregulate, decentralize, accountability. And the land reforms repeat a pattern well known in the Global South: turn ownership into paperwork, then let the poor drown in bureaucracy. The United States, for all its contradictions, still has mechanisms of oversight: Congress hearings, court injunctions, investigative journalism. But Kenya's new laws concentrate discretion inside the executive with little counterbalance. It is as if the checks and balances have been replaced by trust us. Western media, preoccupied with other crises, barely noticed. Most outlets filed brief updates: Kenya passes new digital and economic laws, and moved on. No mention that the signing took place during a national tragedy. No mention that these laws could silence dissent. In the silence of the world, democracy often fades not because of enemies, but because of distraction. And yet, beyond the headlines, something deeper is happening. Across Africa, from Mali to Burkina Faso to Niger, people are questioning the old formula: democracy as a label, not as justice. They are watching leaders like President Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso speak of sovereignty, self-reliance, and truth without permission. And for many older Americans who remember the civil rights era, it feels like déjà vu: the same struggle for voice, dignity, and control over one's own destiny. Perhaps that is why these stories matter. They are not just about Africa. They are about the world we are all building: a world where safety is sold at the price of silence, and where the line between governance and control grows thinner each year. So when you hear about 8 laws signed in Nairobi while a nation was mourning, don't see it as distant politics. See it as a mirror. Because every democracy, whether in Washington or Nairobi, stands or falls on the same fragile pillars: truth, oversight, and courage. And when any of them cracks, the echo reaches us all. So here we are at the end of a week that changed Kenya without a single protest. 8 laws, 8 signatures, 1 silence. What began as a day of mourning has quietly become a day of transformation, not of healing, but of control. The danger of these laws is not only what they contain, but how they were born: in distraction, in secrecy, and in grief. Because when citizens stop watching, power stops asking for permission. And when laws start speaking the language of protection, it is often freedom that needs protecting next. Across Africa, we've seen this story before: leaders promising order, investors promising progress, and people realizing too late that the price was their voice. But it doesn't have to end that way. Awareness is still resistance. Reading, questioning, sharing, these are acts of defense in a time when silence has become the state's favorite weapon. To our American viewers who have followed our work, you know this pattern. You've seen democracies drift, rights redefine, truths blurred. And to our African brothers and sisters, you know the weight of silence. The question now is not what these laws mean, but what we are willing to do with that knowledge. So tonight, don't just watch, reflect, comment, and share. Tell us what stood out to you the most in these 8 laws. Could this same story unfold in your own country? Please share if you feel you are among the few who still see beyond the headlines. And subscribe if you believe that truth, no matter how inconvenient, is still worth defending. Because the moment people stop asking questions, that's the moment democracy dies in daylight.